Welcome to the podcast from Infotagion, the independent fact-checking service recommended by Ofcom. This is the first major public health crisis in the age of social media disinformation, and we're here to try and make sense of it. I'm Damian Collins MP, co-founder of Infotagion and former chair of the House of Commons Select Committee for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. And today we're joined by our special guests from the Parliament in Canada, who are both founding supporters of Infotagion. Nate Erskine-Smith, MP for Beaches East York in Toronto, and member of the Standing Committee on Industry, Science and Technology. And Charlie Angus, MP for Timmins James Bay in Ontario, and a member of the Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics. We'll also be hearing, as always, from our resident experts, the disinformation analyst Dr. Charles Creel and John Quinlan, the CEO of Iconic Labs. Great to be joined for the podcast today by Charlie Angus and Nate Erskine-Smith, who I've worked with over the last couple of years through our respective roles in our respective parliaments in the inquiry on disinformation and in establishing the International Grand Committee, where we work closely with the Canadian House of Commons, looking at disinformation and data privacy issues. I'd like to start the discussion really not so much on disinformation around coronavirus, but looking at something that's a very hot topic at the moment in the UK, which is the whole issue of track and trace apps and the data gathering principles around that. And Nate and Charlie, I wonder if you could give us a bit of an insight into the debate on this in Canada and how the Canadian government or the regional governments might approach this problem, and whether there are similar concerns around data privacy in the way these apps work.
Well, Nathan, why don't you go first?
Sure. So at the industry committee, which I'm now on, we've started this conversation. I certainly had the opportunity to ask questions of our innovation minister and his deputy minister about the digital tracing, digital proximity applications that are potentially under development here in Canada. The challenge at the federal level is that these tracing health efforts are fundamentally led by the provinces, but the deputy minister and minister were very clear that privacy will be central to the development and federal support of these applications, and that they would be opt-in only. And I encourage them to look at the DP3T standard, which is being developed out of the EU. But there is a challenge here that everyone ought to know too, where privacy runs up right against efficacy of these applications, because without significant adoption rates, they really aren't going to have the impact that we might hope.
Yeah, it's interesting for me, coming from the opposition point of view and being very critical of the government's very close relationships with some of the big data players. I know that, with companies like Palantir, a lot of red flags go up. Facebook, and they're friendly, and Google in their very friendly way, they just love to help trace everybody all the time. I've been a little more careful about coming out about our concerns, because what we don't want to do right now is feed into any of the paranoia or anti-government sentiment that could be out there, and that's a delicate balance to walk, because I think in Canada there's a widespread support of the public initiatives. So we're going to be watching it very closely and making sure it doesn't step over the line. But we're, I think, probably be a little more prudent in the kind of questions we're asking, so we're not feeding in to some of the more paranoid, the 5G paranoia, the anti-vaxxers, the people who think that they're being tracked and traced all the time anyways. So it's going to be a bit of a balancing act, but we're definitely going to be watching the issue very closely.
And it's interesting too, just to follow up on that, the joint initiative between Apple and Google, while I initially had some hesitation, from the folks I've spoken to who are very keen and focused on privacy, they view that decentralized system as a positive thing.
Well, it's interesting, because I must admit, I feel very similar, actually. I was initially slightly skeptical. I thought if Apple and Google want to be involved in developing this, then there's got to be a good reason why. And is that what we want? But a system where only the minimum amount of data is shared back to a central database, and really what you really need to know is about whether a contact took place, not necessarily where it was or the wider context of that. And I think this is quite a big moment too, because this is when we've all spent in our respective committees quite a lot of time in the last couple of years looking at data privacy, informed consent around data sharing. But I think probably these apps will be the moment when the public at large really start to think about it and question how this data is being used in a way that probably there wasn't the same urgency or importance around data sharing to play a video game or something similar.
And I think the willingness to accept, certainly I'll speak personally, I don't know for the Canadian public more broadly, but I would be much more willing to forego some level of privacy in the short term if I knew that the data was going to be destroyed at the end of this pandemic, and if I knew that it was going to be effective at limiting the impact of this pandemic and the economic harm that it has wrought.
I think one of the things, Damian, that's really interesting is if this was 2015, we'd be having a very different conversation about this. I think, well, there would be a lot more naivety in how we would have approached the big data offer, and they probably would have had a massive overreach because that was their business model. Certainly, the public efforts that have been undertaken and the work of initiatives like the International Grand Committee have put a spotlight on it and said, okay, if you're going to step up at this time and we need you to step up, what are the protections and limitations? So I think some of the work that we've done is working because they're playing a better role than I think they would have otherwise.
I think that's right. And I think, Nate, you're right as well. I think people will forego some of their rights for a short period of time because it's a public emergency. But I think in Australia, they've made clear that all the data collected will be destroyed at the end of the process. And so therefore people know that there's no long-term implication for giving healthcare data away.
That's exactly right. And it's also important to note that we're not managing these trade-offs in a vacuum. So right now in Canada, we are in lockdown, as you are in the UK, and our civil liberties are obviously seriously curtailed already. And so this is a big if, but if these digital proximity tracing applications could lift that lockdown faster, our overall civil liberties would be better off in the short term. And then the real question becomes, how do we ensure our civil liberties and privacy in the long term, which is destroying the data? Yeah,
exactly. I mean, another, just slightly changing topic and thinking more about content and disinformation. One thing I want to ask you both about, which is again something which is very topical in the UK because the active negotiations between the UK and the US governments on the trade agreement is just beginning this week. One of the things that we've been concerned about is whether the US government will insist on retaining what they call the Section 230 provisions in their legislation, which protect the liability of the big tech companies. It means they're not liable for content hosted on their platforms, not liable for it in law. And I know that was a feature in the negotiations of the trade agreement between America and Canada, where I believe it was required that those provisions should stay in the agreement. So I just wonder whether that was something in your House of Commons that had been discussed.
Well, I'll speak it from the opposition. I didn't feel we had the full, robust discussion on that trade negotiations. In the end, it was I believe the Democrats in the United States that actually improved the agreement. But Chapter 19 is still in, and it is very concerning. It does limit us in a number of significant manners in terms of what steps we can take against the data giants. Now, some of these provisions were brought in when big data was little data, and they were the upstarts, and they were trying to be kept protected from all kinds of copyright lawsuits from what was then the big entertainment industry. But these safe harbor provisions can also allow misuse because it is the liability that the companies have to be held accountable for the kind of algorithms they're using that push people to more extremist content. Now, certainly we see in the age with the COVID crisis, they're playing a much better role than they have in the past. I think they're more aware of it, but the UK will certainly face huge pressures from Donald Trump, from any American regime to protect the interests of the data giants, and that will come at the expense of your ability to develop a digital strategy that works for industry and also for privacy.
We did ask these questions of our chief negotiators at the industry committee, And the response we got back is that liability can still attach insofar as it is criminal liability. So there are exceptions to safe harbor within the new trade agreement. So it does extend safe harbor to some extent. There are exceptions that we could still go after some of these big companies for if we have created laws that would attach criminal liability. Still an open question that I didn't get complete clarity on with respect to where the example I put forward was if I advertise, if I pay Facebook and I advertise, say, a counterfeit product as a obvious example where we're not in a universe where we could start to say, is that speech that should be taken down or not? Clearly, that is wrongful conduct. Facebook has profited from that activity. They haven't acted criminally because they weren't aware of this, but could we have a disgorgement remedy where we would have a civil kind of liability? I think there are challenges with that kind of civil liability, and certainly there will be challenges with that civil kind of liability as it relates to speech and takedown orders. So there are going to be challenges in Canada as we develop some of our new laws, which we promised in the last platform to develop. So I think there are some ways around it, but there are going to be challenges.
Well, certainly, if you're then in a position where you have to legislate to make a criminal offence everything you want to act against, I think
Exactly.
that becomes a problem because things like cyberbullying and malicious disinformation wouldn't be criminal offences in that sense, but might still be in a category of harmful content you want to act against.
Well,
That's
certainly
right.
One of the elements that we were moving towards in our committee study before the last election was the issues of trying to get access to the black box, not to interfere with their trade rights, their intellectual property, but to make sure that those that the algorithms that are being used specifically by YouTube are not pushing people to more extremist content. And that's where I think a liability issue remains outstanding. But the black box will still be protected under the Chapter 19 provisions as intellectual property. There may be ways to handle that if we have egregious examples, but they're certainly going to be very wary of letting other parliaments hold them to account on that. And so we shall have to see if they're willing to be better corporate citizens in the coming years.
And Charlie makes a good point on algorithmic accountability because we in Canada our government has largely in some ways because of the work that we've done in a nonpartisan way at our committee and of course the work we've done internationally, the government moved forward with a digital charter that looked at better internet access, but also looked at expanding privacy protections for Canadians, that looked at competition issues, including data portability and interoperability. I would say that one of the blind spots to that digital charter has been algorithmic accountability and algorithmic responsibility. So maybe we move towards a GDPR-like explainability model, but that ability for a regulator to audit and have the resources to look under the hood and assess what the positive and negative impacts are, the inputs and outputs of that algorithm, we don't have those rules in place, and it's not clear when we'll get them.
Yeah, because I think that's a really good point because as we know, on systems like YouTube, 70% of what people watch they don't search for is played for them by the platform. Therefore, there's a big responsibility on the platform to direct people towards non-harmful content, if you like.
Yeah, and that's the responsibility. I mean, I used the example when we had Google, YouTube come before us, that a 15-year-old wants to learn about World War II history. What they should not be getting are David Irving Holocaust denial videos in the form of supposed historical documentaries, because how would they know that is not just false news, but hate news? And if a journalist or a newspaper published David Irving, they would face charges, but YouTube, it's just in their algorithm. So those are the kind of liabilities that they need to do better in addressing.
And to your earlier point, Charlie, certainly the platforms have taken this more seriously in the course of this pandemic, and one hopes that going forward they maintain that level of seriousness. Of course, the challenge is that so much of the misinformation and disinformation we've seen in COVID can't be traced back to the dark corners of the internet, but in some cases is traced to the largest megaphone in North America, if not the world, the office of the President of the United States. So it becomes incredibly hard to tackle that and to take that challenge head on.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of in our investigations, a lot of what we've looked at about disinformation as a form of harmful content and the responsibilities of the tech companies to act against it has been, I suppose, in a largely political context around election interference and foreign interference from countries like Russia in particular. We're now in the middle of a public health emergency where disinformation around healthcare has become much more important. And whilst there's always been that sort of disinformation out there with certainly the anti-vaccine campaigns, I think it's really brought the idea of disinformation into the public focus a lot more clearly. And I wanted to, is that your experience in Canada? Do you think people are taking notice of this more now because it relates to a public health emergency?
I think that I've been very impressed with the Canadian public. I think people have been very careful. People understand the seriousness. The kind of wild, crazy disinformation that I saw during the Australian bushfire coverage, and it was all over Facebook, anti-climate change deniers with all kinds of false stories. It was toxic, but I've seen much less in terms of COVID. I think there's a number of reasons for that, and one of them is that we're right beside the United States, where, as Nate says, this is the number one center for disinformation right now, and people in Canada are very concerned when we see our next door neighbors with assault weapons standing at the legislatures. It's not where we want to go. And this is the big elephant in the room. And Damian, we were in Washington recently at the disinformation conference, and it seemed to me to be so strange because the Americans are really good at fighting disinformation if they're fighting the Cold War. They were really incapable of even talking about the situation in Washington with Trump. And now we have, the disinfectant claims, the claims that it's being made in a lab in China. This is a much more difficult thing to fight. I think in Canada, we're resisting it because we're very, very concerned about the politics, but the damage that's being done to the international community by a president leading campaigns of disinformation is something we're going to have to really look at, I think, in terms of all of our allies.
My personal experience is similar to Charlie's, though I would note that I've spoken to a couple of experts. Taylor Owen attended at the International Grant Committee. He's a professor here at McGill in Canada. He attended in Ottawa in June. But I also spoke to Timothy Caulfield is another expert who's received some government funding to look at misinformation recently. And both of them have said, we've not only seen a significant scale of misinformation in the course of this pandemic that has been worrisome, but even more worrisome, we've seen that misinformation take hold and help to change people's behavior, which when in the course of a pandemic, we as individuals, for our own safety, we rely upon the collective actions of others. And if that breaks down because of misinformation, it puts us all at risk.
Great. Well, as always on the podcast, we're joined by our two resident experts, Dr. Charles Creel, who's a disinformation analyst, and John Quinlan, the CEO of our partner in Infotagion Iconic Labs. I wonder if I could come first to you, Charles, just to ask you what's caught your eye in the last few days.
Thanks, Damian. This week, there's one big coronavirus fake news story that has everybody's attention. Where did COVID-19 come from? Usually when we chase down a fake news story, we can look to trusted sources, governments, foundations, and news organizations, and we look there for the truth, but that doesn't really work with today's story. So Donald Trump recently claimed that COVID-19 may have originated and escaped from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And Trump claimed to have seen the intelligence, but then he told White House reporters he couldn't tell them any more about it. Next, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo demanded China, quote, come clean about the story. And initially, Chinese leaders blamed Wuhan's wet market, where wild animals are sold. But according to them and Fox News specifically, patient zero worked at the Wuhan Institute and spread the virus after leaving work. This came from sources who claimed that they had been briefed by U.S. intelligence. Britain has also played a role in this story now. As we said last week, Nigel Farage called for an investigation into the origins of the virus, and he pointed a finger at China. And the Telegraph and Daily Mail have carried stories that cast doubt on the Chinese wet market origin story. So what we have is major government figures, intelligence agencies, and international media confirming that coronavirus originated in a lab. Is it true? Probably not. The Five Eyes network is contradicting the lab origin stories. Five Eyes is the intelligence agency alliance that's made up of Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the UK, and the US, and they do intelligence sharing. The World Health Organization says there's no proof and that the White House story is speculative. So has Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison. Even Dr. Anthony Fauci, the leading U.S. expert on infectious diseases, and he's Donald Trump's coronavirus sidekick, says there's no scientific basis for either the theory that the virus was manufactured or that it escaped a Chinese lab. But also, finally, the WHO explained to The Guardian that if there had been manipulation of the virus, you would see it in the gene sequence. And so far, no one has. So let's mark this one fake news.
John, perhaps you could tell us a bit more about what's been happening at Infotagion.
Hey, Damian. Yeah, so as always, never a dull day. I think we were waiting for it, and I'm pleased to announce we had our first claim that mentions that coronavirus was all caused by the Illuminati. So we were, we had a bit of a bingo sort of on when that would be, and delighted to see that's finally happened. So it's been, I think I mentioned last week that it's about, we're seeing a lot around the theme of, a real lack of trust in government. And it's, that's somewhat related to what the guys were saying before, because we've had another one with, as you know, has the US known about COVID-19 for years? And this all plays into, the idea of exactly what the guys were discussing before. And I actually wanted to ask them a question as well, which is about how important they think the public's trust or maybe more importantly, the mistrust, more accurately, is in actually getting these apps to be successful. So I don't know what they think about that, but I think certainly from my point of view, I'm seeing a lot of mistrust at the moment.
Yeah, Nate, Charlie, do you have a view on that?
Sure. I mean, I think obviously trust is critical. It's partly why the privacy advocates that I've seen and respect have called for a greater focus on decentralization, local storage, destruction of data, because all of those measures in their articulation of the argument will build trust, and therefore adoption rates will be higher and there will be greater success. The challenge here is, if you take Singapore as an example, they have an under 20% adoption rate. It's going to be a real challenge with any voluntary system, regardless of the level of trust, to get up to a 60%, 70%, 80% threshold, which is required for these kinds of applications to be successful. So, having gotten my head into this quite a bit because of the industry committee, I am pretty skeptical that we're going to see great success out of these applications because they're voluntary and the adoption rates just are going to be far too low.
In terms of distrust with the government rollout, I wanted to bring one element that I think is very particular here in Canada, and it's one of the very unfortunate things. There's certainly people recognize that the response when COVID hit wasn't the best. We weren't prepared. There's a lot of questions about the WHO. That's fair. There's a lot of questions about China. But our chief medical officer, Dr. Tam, was born in Hong Kong. And we've had a very unfortunate incident with the conservative leadership race, which is focused a lot on anti-China policy. But one of the conservative leadership candidates has specifically challenged Dr. Tam, insinuating she's a tool of the Chinese Communist Party because she was born in China. And that anti-Asian element is very, very concerning to me, because she could become a symbol, like how they rolled it out and what they did. So I think we're all really trying to work to maintain confidence in the rollout. There have been a number of mistakes made. But that confidence is essential to keep people focused and going ahead. I don't think we're going to see a huge uptake in the apps, partly because if it's done through the provinces, we have really differing cultural histories and very different effects. Quebec right now, where we normally have some of the highest levels of social solidarity, is being devastated by COVID. Ontario, with our large population, it's understandable, we're pretty high, but we have other provinces that have very low COVID, and we have one region that's had no COVID because they basically shut themselves off. It's in the far north. So I don't see that those apps will probably have a huge take-up, but there would probably be more questions and mistrust if it was widely pushed. So again, in Canada, we're really, really trying to keep people focused on being positive, on staying the course, on not looking over the border and not doing what the Americans are doing is certainly, I think, helping somewhat in terms of keeping our back, the back stiff on this. But there are definitely distinct issues that we have to deal with in Canada coming out of this.
And I think that's right, that the focus on trust is less about adoption rates for these digital applications and more as we enter into the end of the second month of a real negative impact on our economy and our society, and people are locking themselves in. And I think that sense of social solidarity and that trust in our institutions and trust in our leaders and trust in our public health officials is really critical for continuing the good work that has happened to date to flatten the curve. And that's where the trust is critically important, I think.
Absolutely. Well, just a final point to close. You may have followed that our Prime Minister Boris Johnson he and his partner have just had a baby called, and the first name is Wilfred Laurier. I understand this has gone down very well in Canada.
I didn't know that. I didn't know that, so I don't know how well it's gone down.
Justin Trudeau, but I think it was some. Whether this is fake news or not, I don't know. But there was some sort of.
I think wasn't Wilfred Laurier was a Liberal? I would have thought he would have been John A. MacDonald after our first Prime Minister, Conservative. So, well, he certainly didn't name his baby after Tommy Douglas, our first socialist leader. So,
no, that would have been a step too far.
Yeah.
But it's been really great to have a chat to you again, and I hopefully look forward at some point in the future the International Grand Committee may reconvene, or we have the chance to meet together in person at some convenient location. Well, it would be good to do a post-COVID analysis, and I want to really thank Infotagion. It's been really great. It is inoculating. A lot of times when I start to see crazy stuff starting to appear, I say to people, check out Infotagion, or I send them links. And certainly with the 5G stuff and all the other misinformation, being able to counter it with facts is really, really, really important. And I think it has made a big difference.
And if we can't get together in person in the coming months for the International Grand Committee, our committees in Parliament have started up in a virtual way, and I know you've got a hybrid solution there in the UK, and I see no real obstacle to us convening an International Grand Committee virtually if necessary in the coming months. So I look forward to working together going forward. Absolutely. There's certainly there will remain plenty to discuss. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to the Infotagion podcast, hosted by me, Damian Collins, featuring Nate Erskine-Smith, Charlie Angus, Charles Creel and John Quinlan. It was produced by Lucy and David Dargahi. You can find out more about Infotagion and send us examples of disinformation you've seen by visiting our website, infotagion.com, or using hashtag #IsolateTheLies on Twitter, Instagram and Facebook. Thank you until next time.